Thank you very much. I got that. Thank you very much, Julia, for the introduction, and thank you to Carla for having asked me to join you guys to discuss this morning. I'm going to try to speak a little louder. I guess I tend to kind of fade out but I have to be conscious of the fact that we are online, and so I have to be careful that my voice comes out, projects well. This morning, what I want to do is share with you some of the issues that I've been dealing with in the last really couple of years. As Julia mentioned in the introduction, I am a kind of binational, bilingual, bicultural individual who lives both in Texas, and I travel to Mexico quite often to teach at the university in Ciudad Juarez. In fact, right now, this weekend, I am actually in Ciudad Juarez. I have to teach this afternoon, and then I have to teach tomorrow before I return to Houston on Sunday. So I come and go. And before, I used to teach at the University of Texas, where I became interested in borders, in immigration, in drug trafficking, and all the different cross-border flows. Both legal and illegalized. And I say illegalized because I think we have to be careful to understand that the law is never really neutral. I mean, something that is legal today could be illegal tomorrow, and something that has been made illegal can be re-legalized. And we see that, for example, with marijuana laws in the United States. Marijuana smuggling, for example, used to be a major issue between Mexico and the United States. And now that in the United States, we're looking at the legalization or the re-legalization of marijuana, we very much are in a pattern in which marijuana smuggling has evaporated at the border. So I think that borders are in general kind of the canary in the mine shaft. It is at border areas, liminal spaces, so to speak, that we first encounter what is happening on a global scale. It hasn't always been that way. I think we always, when I begin my classes on global systems or international relations, I always tell the students that the modern nation state is fairly new. For us, of course, it's our entire lives, and we've lived under this particular framework, the nation state, nationalism, citizenship, and a legal system that prevents human mobility. But that hasn't always been the case. In fact, if you look at the history of the humankind, you realize very quickly that for thousands of years, unrestricted human mobility was really the norm. People moved for many different reasons, lack of water, famine, war, migration to explore new lands, new areas on the planet, and that's how we kind of spread around. And I think we cannot understand the impact of immigration today and what kind of effect it has on our politics and our geopolitics if we don't think about the fact that it is its interaction with the modern nation state that makes it controversial. And what I want to put on the table for now is a kind of a couple of hypotheses. Both contradict each other in some ways. One is either immigration is just simply another phenomenon that's there and the nation state is dealing with, and like many other cross-border flows, or immigration is really new and different today, or at least it has new characteristics so that it is now having a substantive effect on geopolitical relations and challenging the nation state the way it's been for the last few centuries. I think that if you look at the emergence of the nation state, we have to go back. If you want to put a birthday on the nation state, I think it might be 1648, the Treaty of Westphalia, because that kind of begins the idea that a nation state is a territory with a defined population bound to that territory, bound by the laws of that territory, bound by loyalty to not a sovereign per se, although that took a while to end, but bound to the nation itself, to the United States, to France, to Russia, to Mexico, and on and on. So clearly, this has been a kind of an evolving phenomenon. And people have nonetheless moved from one area to the other or been expelled. So populations or individuals, groups specifically have been this object of trying to kind of clean out the nation state, move distinct groups of individuals back within a territory where they're acceptable, where they're part of that nation, and therefore part of that nation state. Hence the expulsions of Germans, for example, from Poland, and Hungarians being confined now to what is now Hungary. There's still diasporas, obviously, living right across the border. There's a huge Mexican diaspora in the United States, for example, but it's not as active because some states are considerably better at absorbing culturally and linguistically absorbing those diasporas. I think the United States and France are two clear examples. Other countries are not as successful at absorbing those diasporas, and those diasporas maintain a certain identity and a certain loyalty with the nation of origin or so-called origin. And we see it today in the Ukraine, for example, in the Donbas region. There's a large Russian population that maintains a degree of loyalty towards Russia, even though they live in Ukraine. And so that clearly means that there is a certain degree of discomfort for the Ukrainians as a nation state, but also Russia feels that it has to protect that population. Whether that's true or not, it's a different question. Whether they were in any danger or not is a different question, but they certainly have served as a good excuse by Russia to make an incursion into Ukraine and restore some kind of Russian glory in the so-called near abroad. So populations have always had this kind of, there've always been this kind of piece on this chessboard, and nation states have actually played with those populations. Some have done it, in a very shy way. For example, the Mexican diaspora in the United States is interesting because although over generations, it's actually been absorbed, Americanized, and become part of the American landscape. One of the things that we do see is Mexico trying to reactivate their loyalty towards Mexico. And so a new law was passed in Mexico so that they can claim or reclaim citizenship if their parents or grandparents were of Mexican origin, invite them to move to Mexico, to invest in Mexico, to think about Mexico. So immigrants have always had this kind of dual character. In many ways, they're true globalizers. And that, of course, kind of clashes with some of the discourse on globalization that is going today. Nonetheless, I think the prevailing rationalization for the nation state, and I think the preference of most nation states today, and the legal systems and the education systems are designed to do that, is to kind of understand the nation state as a place with a particular ethnic group, certain linguistic and cultural loyalties to that particular group, even religious loyalties. For example, among the Orthodox, we often see the national churches, and they and even they're considered separate and different in some kind of brotherhood, but still kind of different, or at least a certain degree of national loyalty. And we've seen that in the war between Russia and Ukraine lately. Over time, however, the nation state has become entrenched, and I don't think it's going anywhere today. And so when we look at immigration or populations that move across borders, we always have to think about the anxieties of the nation state, because I think that people moving or people claiming, like many of us do, dual nationalities, dual loyalties, speak several languages, move around, send remittances home, to help family or split families who are in various countries and maintain these interpersonal relations make the nation state very uncomfortable. Why? Because the logic of the nation state is this kind of a sectioned off loyalty, absolute and unconditional, to a particular identity. And I think that's where immigration kind of hits the the sensibilities of the modern nation state. And it has done so, and I think in an increasing way. Back in the 1600s, we still saw enormous mobility in the empires in Europe and other places, and people moved rather easily. Then comes the 1600s, where I think there is a greater rationalization of the nation state, and much of what we understand today of the hardened core of the modern nation state is really of a European creation, specifically with the rationalization of bureaucracy, citizenship, armies, professional armies that we saw in Prussia at some point. And so the European experiment begins with that, with that idea of the nation state. By the 1800s, colonization comes along, and of course, a lot for a few centuries, I think Europeans moved very easily and very freely outward towards Latin America, and settling also in some places in Africa and other places. So human mobility was still the norm, even as the nation state was still kind of becoming consolidated and was becoming kind of hardened legally, and demanded greater loyalty from populations. Most of the individuals still saw mobility as the norm. The 20th century, I think, was slightly different, because I think we saw that the nation state acquired a distaste, so to speak, for increased mobility. I think it is in the 20th century when we saw that the nation state began to deny increasingly, and also use technology and border controls to keep populations in and keep populations out. This is a phenomenon that kind of grew over the 20th century. So this is the issue of immigration is not new. It's just changed in character. And I'm going to say that some of the motivations, some of the reasons underlying migration flows have not really changed. People move for many of the same reasons. What is different, though, is that they are now rubbing against the sensibilities of the nation state, and of course creating important dislocations in the politics of specific countries, and we see some of those reactions. In the sense of border controls and immigration controls, I think the 21st century has actually increased that. So citizenship, loyalty, identity, and law have become kind of entrenched. And I think one of the things that happened in the 20th century as well, which I think was really important, is that citizenship also acquired economic rights. So when we talk about citizenship today, we're not only talking about political rights, the right to vote, to be voted, the right to participate in politics in the state, but also the right to access employment, to access certain economic benefits, to participate in a way that is full and complete in the economic activity of a country. We see it in the United States with immigrants today. Immigrants do not participate, despite the rhetoric and despite popular beliefs, which is, I think it's one of the things that we see in the United States quite a bit, that people think that immigrants come to take their jobs and come and consume welfare state benefits, healthcare and such. The reality is that they've been denied. Towards the end of the 20th century, immigrants began to be denied those benefits. Unemployment benefits, for example, is one of them. Access to healthcare, access to insurance, and of course, confined to certain spaces of employment. Most immigrants in the United States, for example, are employed in the service sector, whether it's construction, agriculture, food processing, the food service industry, landscaping, car washing, and those kinds of industries. That's where the immigrants are confined. So they cannot, the ladder for them, climbing up the ladder is actually very difficult. And slowly the law has confined and made the national space very, very difficult for the immigrant, the individual that arrived as a non-citizen. Has a very difficult time climbing up the ladder. Not everybody, obviously there's exceptions, and some of them come with a high degree of education or acquire education in place. But most of them really work in the lesser skilled. Every job is skilled, of course, and we saw the pandemic gave us a good example of the fact that all members of the workforce are indispensable. We often thought, oh, who are the indispensable workers? The dispensable are those who can work from home, and the indispensable are those that we need to keep the shops open, to keep the food flowing, to keep the agriculture going. So we very quickly realized that they play a vital role in the economy, and we wanted them to continue to work while we were confined. And so clearly they are in many, many ways an indispensable component of any economy. And yet most of the publics within a country feel very uncomfortable with immigrants. But I think we have to consider all these variables, including this variable of the law and how the law has hardened, how technology has come to increase these controls over the individual, over the person, and it has practically bordered the individual itself. We often see it in the United States that people ask, and this is a very common question in the United States. I suppose it's common in Europe as well, where people get asked, so where are you from? And people want to pin people down to a specific place because it gives them a sense of how to deal with that person, how to treat with that person, and often how to discriminate that person. So we clearly see that there is this constant social legal dynamic going on that involves culture, involves identity, involves language, involves economic access, involves political rights, involves a sense of belonging and a sense of expulsion and human rights violations as well. So that, I think, is something that we have to keep in mind. I want to go back to the point of the reasons to move. I think obviously economics is one reason, and people moved in the past for economic reasons. You can go back to the potato famine in Ireland and all the immigrants that came into the United States. You can go back to the utter poverty in Germany back a couple of centuries ago, and you can go back to southern Italy and why people moved, looking for that additional opportunity, a place to make a new life, to make a living, to bring their families and give them a new economic opportunity. And that's still the case. We see the migration flows, for example, here in Ciudad Juarez, where I am right now. If you go to the Leona Vicario Refugee Center, for example, most of the people are moving for economic reasons. There are still economic refugees. So clearly that has always been the case. To that layer, to that kind of original layer that's always been there, you also have social and religious reasons. People also move for other reasons. For example, one of the things that we see increasingly here in the U.S.-Mexico border is individuals who are fleeing repressive cultural and social conditions in their own countries. Not so much religion, but for example, sexual orientation and identity. There's a whole refuge home specifically for individuals who are facing those kinds of issues, transgender issues, and that's not acceptable in their countries, and so they're coming. But how different is that, for example, than the religious persecution that first motivated some of the Puritans to come to the United States, or some of the Catholics that moved out of New England and explored different places, even within the colonies in the United States, like Maryland, which was founded as a Catholic colony, for example. So you have those kinds of issues, and they're still ongoing. I think that one thing that we are underestimated and where we need to put in more time in understanding how it interacts with immigration is really the political reasons or the political instability component. Most of us, when we look at immigration, will look at things like persecution, injustice, economic opportunity. We call them economic refugees and such, but I think we don't think enough about political instability. And the last few months have been very clear. We've seen war and political instability again in Ukraine, and we've seen millions of people who have essentially just moved. Of course, war is not new. It's always been one of the underlying causes of human mobility, and apparently it's still there. We've seen it with the Central American civil wars, where many of the Guatemalans, for example, ended up in Mexico, and many of the Palestinians who ended up in Jordan. And they fled war conditions or expulsions from their countries, and then they ended up in camps that are still in place, for example, in Jordan, and they continue to constitute a political issue for Jordan. When the war was over at the end of the 20th century in Guatemala, the Mexican government also asked Guatemalans who lived in southern Mexico to decide whether they wanted to stay in Mexico and become Mexican citizens or move back to Guatemala. The camps were going to be dismantled. About half chose to stay in Mexico and about half chose to go back to Guatemala. Although interestingly enough, their children who had been born in Mexico were Mexican citizens by birth, and many of them, after having moved back to Guatemala, returned to Mexico to claim their passport. So people, use those kinds of opportunities that they might end up having, and we see it today with many of the deportations in the United States into Mexico. That many of the deportees carry their children with them. They come to Mexico, they settle in Mexico, and then they're growing up, but they have the right of return because they were born in the United States. And so in Mexico, there are now hundreds of thousands. We don't even know the numbers yet, the dimensions, but it could now be reaching into over 1 million people that were born in the United States and will eventually, when they are 18, have the right of return to the United States, and they will kind of have the status but will not have the cultural capital to be able to be integrated very quickly into the United States. Many of these people, by the way, are settling in border towns because while their parents have been deported and cannot re-enter the United States, the children can, and they walk across, literally they walk across into the schools scattered along the border to acquire the education in the United States and be ready to eventually move back into the country. So I think a lot of the things have not really changed. What I think we see today, and it's sort of an interesting juncture, is the idea of the insecurities of the modern nation state, as I mentioned, and migration flows. I think the nation state today feels increasingly uncomfortable with migration flows. Now, I do want to say that there are some things that raise key questions. For example, the fact that accommodating 1 million refugees, Syrian and Afghan refugees, for example, in Europe was so controversial in France, in the Netherlands, in Italy, in Germany, and other places, certainly in Scandinavia as well. And yet accommodating, I think, nearly 4 million Ukrainian refugees has not really been a political problem in Europe. And so that, to me, makes me think or makes me wonder if there isn't a right kind of refugee as opposed to, the one that is completely different and that is unacceptable because the nation state has a conception of itself in terms of culture, in terms of race. And even though some of us don't believe that race exists, race is a functional term. It's a functional a concept in terms of a society. And so we have to speak of it, ethnic groups, race, whatever you want to call it. But at the end of the day, I think there is an acceptable kind of migrant or refugee, or perhaps the reasons are more acceptable. In this case, war expulsions. But it makes me think why 1 million refugees from the Middle East and South Asia are not acceptable, but the 4 million from Ukraine are acceptable. And I don't have an answer for that particular question, but I think it's an interesting issue that we can debate. Now, what I think the dynamics are in the last few years, and I say few years, I'm talking about the 21st century. Even though the nation state is still there, even though its characteristics are still very much the same, and increasingly we're talking about hardened states with specific geopolitical borders, with specific populations, loyalties, cultural characteristics, legal systems, education systems that boost nationalist sentiments and such. That's not really changed. And the reasons why people seek to move are obviously the same. Economic, social, cultural, identity politics, as well as now we realize political instability. A lot of the people that are moving do it for political reasons, from war all the way to ungovernability or even crime, like we see in Mexico. Moving into the United States, a lot of people are being displaced by organized crime, and that's happened in Colombia, and political instability from Venezuelans moving to Colombia and other countries, Peru and Ecuador and Chile and other places, and of course we've seen it with organized crime in Mexico. So the reasons why people move vary, but they've remained relatively stable. What we see in the 21st century is an additional, as the state feels somewhat vulnerable at its borders, because many of these borders are quite porous. The nation state feels very uncomfortable. It feels almost like it's dissolving itself, and when these populations all of a sudden arrive at its borders and kind of begin to kind of claim a space to want to enter. And I see it here at the border. For example, in the United States, we have about 250,000 encounters last month. We're having anywhere around between 180,000 to 250,000 individual encounters at the U.S.-Mexico border. That is almost 1.6 to 1.8 million people trying to enter the United States every single year since 2019, and then of course 2021, 22. That makes the population in the United States very uncomfortable. It makes the United States very uncomfortable because there's a sense that people are pushing against the gates of the nation state. And who are they? What are their intentions? What do they want? I think the sensibility in the case of the United States towards immigration, although it had been there prior, in the 1990s, the U.S. began to build the border and began to build the wall. If you think the wall between the U.S. and Mexico is something new, it really isn't. Some of the first physical barriers began to be deployed in 1994 with Operation Blockade, which was kind of an aggressive term, and it was later renamed Operation Hold the Line. And it was directed at immigration. So immigrants all of a sudden were transformed from simply people moving for different reasons, and people moved from talking about push and pull factors, the expulsion factors and the opportunity factors. They began to see immigrants as a threat to the nation state, whether it's to the identity, whether it, to see them as individuals to dissolve the character of the nation. You may remember, for example, the readings or the literature that emerged back in the late 1990s. I think Samuel Huntington, who was a great political scientist, writing about the end of the United States, the dilution or dilution of the United States as a WASP nation, a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant nation, and then talking about Hispanic immigrants as being of a different character, being they had a different ethos in regard to the market and capitalism, being so different that they would actually end up consuming the United States. So this kind of nationalistic literature began to emerge, and it was surprising that somebody like Samuel Huntington would begin to talk about the United States as such. So I think that those flows that began to come by the millions in the 1990s and have continued by the millions as conditions deteriorate around the world, depending on the spots in different places. I think it's at the end of the day, these migrants end up at the borders, and we see it here at the U.S.-Mexico border. We see it in Lampedusa in Italy. We see it in Turkey with the Middle East immigrants. We see it in Morocco, and then we see it in southern Mexico trying to stop Central Americans. And then, of course, we see some other countries reacting to migrants who come in great numbers because suddenly the society begins to feel that somehow their identity it's threatened. The resources of the nation are now being claimed for additional or by additional individuals that are arriving. And some even intellectuals like Huntington himself begin to think that it kind of dilutes the very character and nature of the nation state. It is a kind of nationalism, however well put it is. Sometimes it's very academic, like in the case of what Samuel Huntington wrote, and sometimes it's very crass, like the treatment of certain immigrants by white supremacist groups. Whether it's in Germany or the United States or in Canada or other places. But at the end of the day, there is this, immigration kind of brings to the fore these sensibilities and these conceptions of what the nation state ought to be in terms of identity, in terms of who belongs, in terms of loyalty, in terms of resources, in terms of who can be here and who cannot. And it is at the borders that we see the most dramatic expressions of all these different dynamics, and I think we've seen it quite a bit in Europe, and we certainly have seen it in the United States, and we've seen it in other countries in addition to that. And by the way, this is not exclusive of Europe. It happens everywhere. The Japanese, for example, have managed to keep immigration at bay, but largely, I think, because it's an island nation. If Japan, I think, were a little bit closer, or at least had some kind of a land border, with some other countries, would probably see conditions that are very similar. I think Japan is exceptional because it is protected by the seas, and it's not that easy to get there. But the seas don't often stop immigrants from attempting to get there, because we see it in the Mediterranean, for example, which is a lot closer, and Europe is very attractive to a lot of the Middle Eastern and African immigrants. And so we see these dynamics. One of the things that we've seen, those of us who study borders, is that as the states begin to feel very insecure, we're talking about the insecure state here, because all these immigrants are coming at its borders and are trying to penetrate the national territory. We've seen states begin to cut deals with their neighbors, and these are international agreements. We saw the Third-Country Agreement between Europe and Turkey, in which these immigrants were going to be kept in Turkey, and they were going to have to ask for asylum there before they could ask for asylum, and be denied there before they could ask for asylum into the European Union, or they had to be processed away from the European Union and be allowed under an orderly and well-managed process. We've seen it in the United States as well. The United States and Mexico have currently an agreement called the Migration Protection Protocol, which I think it's a misnomer, because it really doesn't constitute any kind of protection for immigrants. I think immigrants kind of are huddled in Mexican border towns or in Mexican towns, very often vulnerable to the activities of criminals or organized crime even. But it's an agreement. And so what we've seen the nation states, specifically the wealthier nation states like Europe and the United States, is to kind of extend or move their border controls outward towards Turkey, towards Mexico, towards Guatemala, towards other places. And so migrants, the volume of migrants and the sensibilities of the nation state now begin to create these arrangements or these agreements, third country agreements, really that's what they are, in which migrants are now forced to stay there. The program is also called Remain in Mexico, even though officially it's called the Migration Protection Protocol. You have to remain in Mexico and stay there until we can take you in. And of course, that means that the United States has implemented a metering process by which only about 30, 40 people can come in per day when you have essentially 1.6 million encounters per year. So clearly that's not enough. So people have to mill around. And then, of course, Mexico had to, under threat by Donald Trump, deploy additional National Guard members to stop immigrants from coming into southern Mexico and then making the 2,000-mile trek, 2,500-mile trek towards the United States. So we now have these attempts at regional immigration control because the states, for the states, it's no longer enough to have the problem at their borders. They now want to make sure that they build these concentric circles to protect themselves from these waves of migrants that kind of keep arriving. And that's something new. That's something that we're seeing in the 21st century that we had not seen before. Most of the times before, migrants moved, and then they were generally moved right across the border, or they were.
Kind of remind of the General Assembly tomorrow, I guess. And then
there was a system by which they could manage these border flows, and now what we have is essentially states trying to delegate the enforcement conditions to other neighboring states, and I think we've seen it in Mexico. Unfortunately, I think this will continue to. Before I address the issues, what is happening inside the nation state in a few minutes, I do want to say that I think one of the things in the 21st century that is slightly different is that we are beginning to see that globalization has become kind of a threat to the nation state. Now, why do I want to mention the issue of globalization? Look, for a very long time, clearly globalization was a phenomenon that rubbed against the nation state. The nation state was, over the course of a few centuries, consolidating itself, creating national economies. In fact, borders are very often of a kind of an interesting laboratory to study institutions, because sometimes, for example, today I'm in Ciudad Juarez, and I see that the country operates under certain institutions, certain concepts of what the market is, what democracy means, what rights are. And then I cross over the bridge into the United States to El Paso, Texas, and then I see that the United States operates under a different understanding of what the market ought to do, what democracy means, what rights are, and such, and so on and so on. So you can see how you have two populations, because El Paso, for example, is about 85% Mexican in ethnic origin, and Juarez is obviously 100% Mexican in origin. So you have two populations that are very much the same. They have the same background, the same ethnic group, and yet they operate under different institutions, and so their outcomes are completely different. And so borders are kind of an interesting place to study those kinds of things. But I think obviously, as the state was being built over several centuries and consolidating territories, populations, loyal identities, legal systems, and such, globalization was sort of in the background. Of course, I'm not going to say that colonization wasn't going on. Obviously, there was a process of globalization. The only difference is that globalization was being operated by a certain elites, particularly European, through colonization. So that kind of colonization, that kind of globalization was under the control of specific groups and was acceptable. When Europe, of course, at the end of the 20th century, when Europe lost control of its colonies and all of a sudden all these nations began to emerge and began to claim their own nation statehood and began to sort of reassert themselves, we saw the partition of India and Pakistan, for example, which was really a horrific event for many Muslims and Hindus between Pakistan and India. So all these different accommodations into these nation states continued well into the 20th century. But obviously, globalization got out of control as technology and communications advanced as well. All of a sudden, globalization flattened out and became a more kind of a more democratic sort of phenomenon. Not that it ended by any means. Globalization prior to this was conducted and under control of certain nation states under certain interests and certain I guess, economic motivations. But now globalization is much more democratic. Now immigrants move, individuals move, tourists move, markets move, capital moves, goods move. And so there's a continued process of globalization that is accelerated. If you haven't read the book The Box by Mark Levinson, for example, I think it's worth a read. How the whole book is about the container box, the container that you see the ships with the containers, sometimes thousands of containers stacked up on a single ship, moving goods from China to the United States. And it's very interesting because a single innovation, which was essentially the ship, the boxes on those ships, really shrank the market, and all of a sudden operations could set up shop in China, and then the products can be consumed in New York, or operations could be set up in South America, and the goods would end up in Europe. And so all of a sudden we see this more democratized immigration, democratized globalization, and I think immigration is part of it. All of a sudden, immigrants are a force of globalization. They're not only a force of development through the remittances, and by the way, the remittances today are reaching 600 to 700 billion dollars in remittances. That's more than all the foreign aid that rich countries really give to poor countries. So migrants are becoming also a force of globalization as they move. But they create certain dynamics in the modern nation state that makes them very insecure and attempts to reinforce the borders. And so what we've seen today is not only, as I mentioned, the deployment in space of enforcement mechanisms like in Turkey and Mexico, but we also see border walls. If you look at the construction of border walls today, there are some 70 border walls being built around the world. We often see the Palestinian-Israeli wall, which is kind of an aggressive wall. It's essentially ghettoized Palestinians into smaller spaces, crowded spaces. And we see the US-Mexico border wall slowly being built, and we saw the whole campaign by Donald Trump. So what we've seen is the nation state trying to protect its skin, trying to again sort of prevent that in different through different mechanisms, prevent these migration flows. But migrants are part of this democratization of globalization, this increasing movement. The problem, I think, with many of the free trade agreements, for example, NAFTA and now USMCA, is that they certainly accommodate the flows for capital, for goods and services, but not necessarily for people. It's very hard for countries to talk about markets, labor market integration, that is, and the ability of people to come and go. And when they do it under very controlled conditions. Canada, for example, has a very successful guest worker program. 70,000 Mexicans, for example, work in Canada every year that are given temporary visas, go work, and then come back to Mexico. And so there's countries try to control this movement. So we haven't yet found a way to accommodate labor force integration, markets, and immigrants. And so at the end of the day, I think that's because they touch to the very core of the identity, the loyalty, the rights, and the resources of a nation. And I think that's where the sensibility of the modern nation state comes from. Now, to sort of start kind of wrapping it up, I want to address the issue of the politics in a nation state. Clearly, what countries do deny human rights to immigrants, deny entry to immigrants, limit access to markets. And by the way, the precarization of life within the national territory is also another tool that states are using to induce self-deportation. For example, in the United States, because it's almost impossible to deport 11 million undocumented immigrants in the United States. One of the things that has happened is that the law and the regulations of the state are increasingly making it very difficult for immigrants to live, work, and even prosper in the country, so that they self-deport. Things are so miserable. The stress is so high that immigrants then begin to self-deport. And there's been a lot of self-deportation from the United States back into Mexico and back into other countries. People just can't tolerate living under that stress in those conditions because we make it very difficult for immigrants. So states make it difficult within the border, reinforce with border walls, add technology, add boots on the ground, add budgets, push other countries to manage the immigration flows like Turkey towards Europe or Morocco towards Spain or Mexico towards the United States. They kind of commission or delegate the enforcement mechanisms and then become more punitive towards immigrant, more exclusionary towards immigrant. But states, the key here is it the choice by the governments of those nation states that are implementing these measures, or are they just responding to the sensibilities of their populations, of their residents, of their constituencies? I don't know. I really don't think. I think it's probably a combination of both, but I think it's worth unpacking the question, because I think it's really interesting to think whether what Trump proposed to do, his anti-immigration stances, for example, are a response to the anxieties of the American public. And you see it with Cinque Stelle in Italy, you see it with Alternative für Deutschland in Germany, you see it with nativist parties in the Netherlands, or with Marine Le Pen in France. I mean, you see it all over the place. You see it everywhere. I was having a conversation with some Russian colleagues at some point, and I was wondering how they handled, for example, the Muslim populations in Russia. Within Russia, there are many different ethnic groups and languages that have lived within the Russian state. But what happens when they migrate to Moscow, for example, where the ethnic group is Russians, where the religion is Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, where the language is Russian, that it has a very clear identity, and when somebody who has perhaps the right. And so I think in many ways, some of these internal passport dynamics that we saw in the Soviet Union were really to sort of keep these ethnic groups sort of separated within the state. So states implement many different ways to kind of manage these population flows so as to not create these kinds of clashes. So it is important to put these questions out on the table, whether states in Europe, the United States, Canada, these nativist parties that we've seen emerged, with the exception of Japan, of course, that we've seen a kind of an exception in terms of immigration. When we see these nativist parties, these nativist feelings, are states responding to that, to the anxieties of the population? Not necessarily. I would say yes, under certain circumstances, and this is where the hypotheses turn interesting. But I would also say that to some extent, it is the states themselves, well, I should say governments themselves, political parties, and opportunistic politicians that are also stoking the fears in the population. So it just doesn't, it's not necessarily the state adding resources, changing laws, building walls, delegating enforcement as a response to the anxieties of the national publics. It's not just that. It's that within those national publics, there are also opportunistic populist politicians who could not otherwise get into power, could not otherwise gain traction as politicians in their states, because their fundamental platforms, political platforms, are really much more aggressive. But clearly, this has always been there. We saw it in Germany against the Jews in the 1930s. And we've seen it in other places, by the way. It's not unique to Germany. I think the expulsion of the Jews and Muslims, conversion or expulsion in the late 1400s in Spain was a kind of an early proto-populist politics. In agreement with the Vatican to some extent, but it was about trying to clean out the Spanish state and gain recognition as a kind of a Catholic kingdom. So these kind of politics of whether it's proto-populist politics or whether it's the more modern, sophisticated populist discourse that we see today, in many of the more sophisticated politicians, and often not so sophisticated. I wouldn't say that Donald Trump, for example, is an extremely sophisticated politician. Populism is populism. But so what we see is kind of and this is where I think we academics have to kind of unpack that. It's not just that the state is responding to public anxiety, but the politicians themselves are creating moral panics. They themselves are stoking feelings in the population to be able to gain power. And this is, I think, where we have a problem also of illiberal democracies. What happens to a democracy when any politician can all of a sudden adopt a certain discourse and then direct its discourse and tap into the most primal fears of the national loyalty of a political constituency in a country. And that is where I think it's kind of a two-way street. On the one hand, you have perhaps a state that cannot necessarily handle all the populations that might want to be in it. Millions of people might want to migrate to the United States, for example, but it's not possible for the country to absorb all of that population. Maybe the same thing in Europe, despite the fact that they have demographic challenges and that immigration could probably solve a lot of those demographic challenges that they're facing. But it kind of goes to the sensibilities of the other. And I think that's one of the things that we see politicians do, that they themselves sort of detect in the kind of a very smart way that immigrants are a particularly interesting political resource, where they can certainly kind of create an environment towards immigrants, towards the other, and sort of stoke these political fears or these kind of primal fears about nationalism, and then translate it into political action, whether it's creation of new political parties, whether it's votes, candidates, rhetoric. And of course, that at the end of the day creates additional aggressiveness from society towards immigrants. And so it kind of feeds on itself. And I suggest that in the 21st century, this is exactly what is happening. This is what we've seen. Perhaps not unreasonable. I think that there are some genuine complaints by domestic publics when it comes to globalization. Clearly, the crisis of 2008, 2009 showed the excesses of capitalism, almost unregulated capitalism, what many people call neoliberalism in some countries, like in Mexico, right? And in France as well, some of the people in France who believe that the economic conditions or the hardship, it's hard for me to think that the French face any hard economic conditions compared to other countries, but it's perspectival, right? I mean, they're ultimately in France, and if they face economic conditions that are slightly difficult for them according to their expectations and standard, well, that opens the opportunity for opportunistic politicians, populist politicians, to go in and stoke these cleavages and these divisions and this kind of fire in countries, and we're seeing it. And that is something interesting that we see. And so the states react often with these policies against immigrants. And why are immigrants so vulnerable to this kind of domestic politics, particularly practiced by these populist politicians? Because immigrants have no rights, because the nation state was already instituted under the idea that citizens have certain rights, especially in democracies, and immigrants cannot vote. So immigrants cannot be part of a constituency that can show up at the polling place and exercise a pushback in the polling place at the booth, at the voting booth. So it's not possible. Immigrants are defenseless when it comes to political rights to a large extent. And there is a very low political cost to abusing immigrants. They don't have any political power. So if you abuse people, a certain group in a society that has political power, then there may be a political pushback and even a political consequence. In the case of immigrants, they just don't have that kind of leverage. And immigrants are very easily othered. In other words, look, we are Germans, they are Pakistanis, we are Christian, or at least have a Christian culture, Judeo-Christian tradition and they are Muslim. Look, we have these physical characteristics and they have these other physical characteristics. And I think this is what Samuel Huntington, for example, was thinking about when he was kind of writing about Latin American immigration, particularly Mexican immigration to the United States. The immigrants can be easily othered. And so they provide this perfect opportunity for opportunistic politicians to set them against us or us against them, and then to portray them as a threat to our identity, a threat to our language, a threat to our traditions, a threat to our religious inclinations or affiliations, because they're so different. You see it in France with the hijab, for example, trying to prevent women from wearing Muslim women from wearing the hijab. And so immigrants are very easily othered. In addition to being politically powerless, they're very easily othered. And they can also be very easily blamed for policy failures. I think September 11 is a perfect example of how immigrants can be blamed. I've written in the past, and I've said in many forums, for example, that the failures of the intelligence community in the United States to prevent the attacks of September 11 was essentially an intelligence failure. All the component parts, all the pieces to put that puzzle together were already in place. The CIA had information, the FBI had information, local authorities had information, individuals and companies had information, everybody had information. If the intelligence services had done their work, they would have actually foiled that attack of September 11th. But what was the reaction of the United States immediately after September 11th? Shut down the border. This was about immigrants. It was about others. It was about Muslims. It was them who came here, used planes, and attacked the United States in Washington, in New York, and of course the plane in Philadelphia. So clearly, this was a policy failure. This was an intelligence failure. There was a problem of the United States community that wasn't able to prevent this attack the way they had done before, and yet immigrants became the scapegoat. So clearly immigrants can be scapegoated very easily. They can be blamed for what is really policy failures by the government. And politicians are very happy to displace blame for their own failures. And I think in the case of September 11, it was very clear that they made it about borders. They made it about immigrants. Those guys that were taking those classes to pilot planes came into the United States with a visa. They were students. They had a student visa. It was a failure. The undocumented migrants and the documented migrants that went into the United States to work, they're not the ones that conducted the attacks on the United States in Washington and New York, but they were blamed. It was immigration that became the focal point for what it is a policy failure. So immigrants can be very easily scapegoated for a number of things. The argument of resources is still there. I think it hasn't gone away. I think we saw that argument emerge early in the 1970s. Oh, they're taking our jobs. Why in the 1970s? Because in the 1970s was a very difficult economic decade in the United States. And so immigrants were blamed. They're taking our jobs. They're consuming our resources. Because the logic of the nation state today, the economic logic of the nation state is built around a national economy, a national labor market. And that by economizing or making citizenship economic, you also then begin to think about immigrants as opposed and up against economic citizenship and the idea of consuming additional resources. I think that that's what we see today. And those are the dynamics that we're seeing in Hungary, for example, with Viktor Orban. This is what we're seeing even in Poland to some extent, Kaczynski. This is what we see in the United States with Trump. Not so much with Biden, but it's still there because the Republican Party is still very much talking about these issues. This is what we see with Marine Le Pen, despite her softened message, I think, in the last election, trying to kind of portray a softer face, raising little cats and things like that. I think the French didn't buy it, fortunately, but it was there. And this is what saw it with Salvini in Italy. This is where we see it, I think, to some extent in Japan. closing its borders. But I think at the end of the day, immigration is not going to stop. Immigration is part of globalization. It is the utmost democratization of globalization forces. Immigrants will continue to go. And I'll say this because there is one emerging factor that is beginning to make people move and that we have not yet addressed fully, and we don't yet fully understand the extent to which this is going to go. And it has to do with climate change. That's the one new factor that is going to now is going to have to be put on the table for us to discuss. Not that the economic push factors have left, and not that the political instability, civil war factors have left, not that the the social and cultural factors are gone away. But now on top of those layers, we have climate change. And I think climate change will drive increasingly more people to move. They will simply not have the water. They'll move to cities where they can, and then they'll move to other countries where they can. And if the humankind does not manage to understand that this is a global phenomenon, it's always been, by the way, but that this is going to intensify thanks to climate change, I think we're up for a very rough ride in the next few decades for the humankind. We have to find ways to reconceive the nation state, reconceive labor market forces, reconceive the way populations are absorbed, and we need them anyway. I mean, in the United States, we're doing a lot of research today about the way that demographics are changing in the United States. Last year, the United States added 395,000 residents in the country, 0.01%, the lowest population growth in the history of the United States. We are now in the US an aging population. We are now 10,000 people are retiring a day, and we're not adding enough people to replace them. Most industries in the United States report today that they don't have enough workers. This is the case in Europe too. In Italy, in Spain, in Portugal, people are aging out. Immigrants need to be accommodated. And so if we don't begin to have this conversation and begin to sort of discuss how to accept the reality of a more democratized globalization that involves human mobility, then we're not going to be able to get our arms around it, control it in an orderly and legal way, and we will continue to have these ongoing crises at borders, states reacting, and of course, the worst part, as I mentioned, is give space to opportunistic politicians, populist politicians, to continue to endanger our democratic politics at home, whether it's in Europe or the United States. And so I don't, sorry to end with this very pessimistic note, but there is still time. We can do it. We can try to contain climate change, but we can also begin to address some of the foretold consequences of climate change so that we don't find our democracy, our freedom, and our own humanity at risk in the next few decades. I'll stop there to leave some time for conversation. All comments welcome, all questions welcome, please. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Payan. That was an extremely interesting and dynamic discussion. And I'm really happy you mentioned the ecological element also, because I had a note, so I was curious what your thoughts were on that. And I have a set of questions that kind of came up through the course of the dialogue, but I wanted to open the floor to anybody that has been tuning in throughout the conversation to ask their questions first, if they'd like, and then if there's time, then I'll toss mine out there. We have about 30 minutes, if I'm not mistaken. Yes. So there's any questions?
And not just questions, please, your comments will be very welcome in terms of hypotheses, research, your thoughts. I'd be happy to react to them.
Or if there's none at the moment, I actually had one on the recent British intentions to it's a refusal, like I've read articles on this refusal to do offshore processing, but actually to process like immigration and asylum claims in Rwanda. I'm not sure if this is finalized or not, but I saw that it was a really shocking article actually. And I was just wondering what your thoughts were and what are the implications for this. Even France offered to process claims on their soil. But I'm not sure to what extent you're familiar with this issue. It's kind of been a stain on the human rights world. Everyone's been talking about it a little bit, but what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, it's not an unknown mechanism, by the way. I think some of us have had discussions with policy individuals in the United States, and they've, when they ask, what do we do? What are some of the recommendations? I think that particular recommendation has actually come up, which is essentially to use the American consulates, because so many of the immigrants are coming from Honduras, Guatemala, less from El Salvador now. I mean, it shifts, it goes back and forth depending on the country. And then some are coming from Haiti, and then beyond, right? Venezuela, and there's other places. And so the idea there was, why don't we use the consulates, the United States consulates, to allow people to file for asylum in the consulate in place where they are, closer to their hometown, and have their interview there so that the visa officers can assess the validity of the asylum claim. And then if they are approved, then they can move to the United States. If they're not approved, then they're in place and we don't have to see them at the border. So it's a mechanism that I think more countries are beginning to use, which is essentially, okay, we have an issue with refugees. And notice that this is particularly about refugees. The problem that I see, I wouldn't see is huge a problem with the processing of asylum claims in place. It may, in some ways, not necessarily every way, be better than succumb to the seduction of organized crime, and then or take the risks to move through a third, fourth, fifth country, depending on how many countries you have to cross or transit to get to the point where you're going. So it may not be bad. I think where the failure or the
signed
problem
in earlier, the speaker was like, I heard a loud noise, and then I checked my thing just as I signed in.
I think where the problem is really whether the law of asylum is going to change. In other words, are you willing and open to increase or be more generous with the way you assess a claimant? Are you willing to say, okay, we, together with the assessment of these claims at the consulate in Rwanda or in Guatemala City or whatever, or in Bogota, Colombia, for Venezuelans, who are almost 2 million Venezuelans now live in Colombia. So we can hear those cases there. But are you willing to also shift the law to be more generous? Or is it going to be so stringent that these people will eventually say, the chances of me getting asylum or an opportunity to move to the UK or to the United States or to Canada are so slim that I'd rather take my chances and go take the risk to undertake the trek north, or take the offer of this individual that operates with a smuggling ring and show up at the border, and that may be a little bit better than just get on a list that's going to take a long time. So if those countries do not assign additional resources and make their laws for asylum more generous, it's not going to solve the problem. It's going to create an illusion that you can claim for asylum in place, but it's not going to change the dynamics.
Well, and that definitely, it does lend some clarity in terms of creating a different set of opportunity costs that people consider prior to migration and after they've migrated, whether or not they want to stay and go through that drawn out process or return home. But the specific issue that came up, and I felt so bad, I didn't do it justice when I explained it, but
Yep.
So there's kind of a controversial deal between the United Kingdom with Rwanda to relocate certain asylums there, not necessarily for offshore processing or even possible settlement within the United Kingdom as a permanent destination, but within processing within the Rwandan system for relocation there. And there is some financial incentive that's tied to it. And so it's looking like it might symbolize this next step in a broader policy push that some high income countries might be taking to kind of externalize this migration management and kind of pay people to, or entities to accommodate what they would view as an overflow, rather than, regardless of whether they've come legally or illegally, it would cut that venue for migration.
Oh, I see. Okay, yeah, I think that we've seen that. I mean, I think this is what the third country agreement that the European Union concluded with Turkey is about, which is essentially ask for asylum in Turkey first. If you get denied there, then you can apply to Europe. So it was I'm not even certain, how much Turkey was offered, but there was an incentive. There was a financial incentive to accept those asylum claimants in Turkey. So it wasn't just that. This is what a third country agreement was about. Essentially, first seek an asylum there, and only if you're denied there can you come here. And then, of course, money is given to that country. It's a perverse incentive. I see it very much as the one you explained with Rwanda. I see it very much because obviously offering Rwanda X billions of pounds to keep these migrants there, ask for asylum in Rwanda first, and such creates an incentive for the Rwandan government to force those people to stay in Rwanda when the conditions may not be the right conditions. The difference between those two agreements, as I understand them, and the Remain in Mexico agreement is that Mexico never accepted that component of apply for asylum in Mexico first. So it wasn't quite a third country agreement like the one with Turkey, and if I understand this one with Rwanda, it was really stay there because we don't have the capacity, the physical capacity to process all these, 200,000 people a month. We can only process 40 or 50 a day. So you're going to have to stay in Mexico and wait for your turn. And what they did is they created this metering system, which essentially is 40, 50 a day. That's all we can take. That's all we can process. That's all we can examine, and then go through the entire process of asylum, and then give them their transit visa into the United States to their destination, and then give them a notice to appear before an immigration judge at their point of destination, Philadelphia or Atlanta or Dallas or wherever they were going. Mexico never accepted that. However, it did accept keeping the migrants milling around in Mexico while they waited to enter the United States. I think this is what is happening. Those countries are beginning to say, look, all it takes is a little money. And if the country is desperate enough, I guess Turkey, Rwanda, Mexico, perhaps, although it's slightly different. The agreement with Mexico is slightly different. The agreement with Guatemala is a little bit similar, though. Guatemalan Hondurans were told to stay in Guatemala and ask for asylum in Guatemala first before they could. If there was an incentive, a monetary incentive for Guatemala to retain Hondurans and have an asylum processing for Hondurans in Guatemala, I'm not aware of. I've never seen it, but I wouldn't doubt that the United States offered Guatemala an incentive. Look, it's not going to solve anything. Eventually, if the conditions on the ground, whether it's Rwanda or Guatemala or Turkey or anywhere else, are not right, migrants will continue to move. And those countries like Rwanda or Turkey or Mexico or Guatemala are not going to be able to absorb the millions of migrants that we expect in the next few decades, particularly under climate change conditions. So this has to be a global management. The problem with the system is that it's still one-on-one management, but the flows are global and in every direction. When I teach classes on immigration, we also talk about south to south migration. people from Venezuela moving to Colombia, or people from Bolivia moving to Brazil, or people from Bangladesh moving to neighboring countries. So we talk about these incentives that are not going to be enough. Those are kind of temporary measures that may help a little bit ease the flow, if at all. But if the conditions, the structural conditions that make people move and that we mentioned do not change fundamentally, it's not going to have a long-term effect on migrant flows at all.
And thank you. That lends a lot of clarity, and it cuts to the root source of migration as well. I did have one other question, but I wanted to touch base with everyone that's listening. Are there any questions throughout the audience right now?
I hear crickets.
And if not, I might toss you one more.
Yeah, sure.
So what might digitalization, like for example, the metaverse, the internet, any aspect of the digital domain, what might this do to affect our understanding of nation citizenship and migration, or our policymakers' understanding of this?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I've never thought about that. I can only give you my initial reaction. Look, the thing about the internet is that it's both good and bad. I mean, obviously, it's technology. It works for a lot of us. I mean, here we are, right, having a nice conversation. I mean, on the U.S.-Mexico border right now, and you guys, a lot of you are all over the place. But look, it also serves to organize people, to organize migrants. We've seen some of the big thousands of individuals march in caravans through Mexico towards the U.S. border. So it also serves to kind of organize and provide information. People say, hey, they're taking more people in Ciudad Acuña in the state of Coahuila, Mexico, as opposed to South Texas, or let's go to California because they're processing people more easily there. So information is going to flow more easily. People are going to be able to organize more easily. Organized crime will also be able to organize people more easily and work more easily with migrants and charge and pay, and so the internet. For those of us who have the fortune of having multiple citizenships, or the ability to move globally without restrictions, that's also very convenient. I mean, we obviously have the ability to tap into all kinds of resources. I know that Ireland, for example, and I have some friends in the United States, was trying to attract Irish Americans back to Ireland to work and live in Ireland, and some people did. I mean, a lot of the descendants of the Irish immigrants, the waves of Irish immigrants that came to the United States in the mid-1800s and then the early 1900s, many of them have claimed citizenship. Some of the Spanish that came to Mexico in the 1930s now can apply for their citizenship to go to Spain because they were expelled during the Civil War in Spain, and now they can, their children, grandchildren, can reclaim Spanish citizenship. And I also know some people who have applied. I a couple of years ago, before the pandemic, I went to Spain, and I went to visit a friend in northern Spain. She's from Guanajuato, Mexico, and she's a chef. She's a great chef out there in some town in the Basque Country. And so I had a good conversation with her. Well, she's one of those Mexican citizens whose grandfather was expelled by Franco in Spain, and she's now, she now has a Spanish passport and went back. So all this information flow, all this, the ability to organize, the ability to reclaim space, the ability. So I can only think that this is going to facilitate and further democratize human mobility. The problem with human mobility and the democratization of human mobility is that the nation state and the legal systems are not ready for them. And so we need to really go back to the root and say, hey, if capital goods and services are good to move across borders, let's create also a regime for human mobility. And we have a good example of how to do it. Europe is a good example of how you can do it in an orderly, legal way. I mean, Europeans can live and work and study in different countries, and they can move. It's interesting to me, though, that despite this opportunity, most Europeans stay in place, right? I mean, most, there was a lot of doubts early during the Schengen negotiations that all of a sudden it was like, if we bust borders open, there's going to be chaos. Everybody's going to be moving. Everybody's going to take in their backpacks and their stuff, and it's going to be. The reality is that they didn't. Greeks can move, but most of them stay. Portuguese can move, but most of them stay. The Germans can move, but most of them stay. And so, it's good to know that you have that ability, and most people would use it. But I don't think that that we're working toward it, and perhaps the internet is just one other instrument to democratize mobility if we use it right, to allow people to apply for jobs and visas and participate in programs and move. But if the legal frameworks are not right, if the nation state is not more secure in itself and its existence in the face of globalization, resistances to any instrument that may democratize human mobility may only grow.
Well, and that's extremely interesting that you mentioned the example of the EU as a positive case study too, because you could invert it as well and look at, okay, the openness within the borders of the EU also culminates to like an equal hardness on the outside, particularly with the creation of Frontex in 2004. So it's within a decade of this Operation Blockade, and kind of the first like micro pushback against democratized globalization. Then it kind of took off very positively, lots of positive perceptions till 2015, and we're back in this kind of downturn. So it goes through peaks and valleys. So there's a chance.
That's right. I mean, at the end of the day, I think Frontex is a good example. It's like the Border Patrol. And now you see the conditions. You don't see them in the border between France and Germany, but you see it on the border between Turkey and Greece, or in Lampedusa, between Libya and Italy, I guess. And so, all you're doing is moving it out. I mean, it's one of the things, and I can only think that that's just going to get worse. But I don't conceive of Russia building a border wall all around itself. Who knows? The only thing that I'm afraid is that immigration is interacting in a very negative way with our domestic politics, because of politicians that are very opportunistic. And so if we're talking about illiberal democracies, I think I'm yet to see a good academic work addressing the issue of how immigration has become one more piece in the chess of illiberal democracies. And I think it's very obvious. We've seen it, but I think it's it takes we need to explore those areas a little bit more.
And thank you. And I suppose, I noticed on your write-up, you had a list of some recommended readings, but were there any additional resources that you wanted to add that would be good for additional insights, or?
I think the reports, if I want to add something about the last thing, because it's not my area of expertise, so I have written or thought about that considerably less. But I thought that maybe looking at climate change and anticipating climate change is going to be. So there are some really good reports by the United Nations and other organizations about what climate change can do. Most of us are trying to anticipate where the flows are going to be. Like, for example, we think about Bangladesh as a country that is so low in terms of the sea level that if the seas rise, just by a bit, almost the entire country of Bangladesh, which is over 200 million people, will disappear. 200 million people is a lot of people. So where are they going to go? India already has 1.4 billion people. In the neighboring countries, can they absorb 200 million Bangladeshis? it's going to be very hard. So I think that that's the new frontier. And I would kind of encourage everyone to sort of look at those reports. Those are really very good. We don't yet understand the dimensions of it. We're still speculating. We haven't done yet all the academic work that needs to be done on that, and what is required in terms of public policy to begin to accommodate those flows in the next decades. So that would definitely, those reports are great. I don't have them at hand right now, but they're very good reports that begin to sort of put a frame around the gravity of the issue.
Great, thank you so much. And I feel like you've covered a phenomenal number of bases throughout the last hour and a half.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you. And thank you for the invitation, and thank you everyone who was here at the session. Glad to do it anytime.
Oh, wonderful. And one last all call for any final questions. There are about 5 minutes remaining. However, if everyone feels good, feels enlightened, then we can probably call this meeting to a close. And once again, thank you so much for sharing your time with us. We really appreciate having you.
Thank you, Julia. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you everyone. And if anyone needs to get in touch with me in the future, I'm at the Baker Institute at Rice University in Houston. So you can feel free to write to me if you need it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.